Okay, so getting started here, what we first want to understand is what this AJAX method is actually expecting. So looking at the documentation, we can see that the first thing that it is expecting is a URL. So the URL is the string containing the URL to which the request is being sent. And in this case, we examined this earlier. The URL contains our JSON file, and this URL is linked in the show notes, so we've got that part down. And next, there are some optional settings that you can pass to the AJAX method. And we're going to go through some of the settings that we're going to be working with together. So two that I want to introduce you to are, firstly, pretty straightforward, there is a data type setting. This data type is basically going to be the key we use, and the value is going to be the data type. In this case, it's going to be JSON. So just specifying to our AJAX method that when it requests the data that is going to be returned is going to be JSON. Now, moving down, there is one more setting that I'd like to introduce you to, and it's this success setting here. So in this case, success is going to be the key. And the value of success is going to be a function that we want called if the response is successful. So if we request the data and it is returned to us successfully, we want to go ahead and execute a function on that response returned. You following? And it's good practice in this case to also use something like the error setting. So the error setting in this case is going to be a function that is called if our request for data is unsuccessful. So if that server were ever down, how do we want to handle that situation? So that's where we're going to get started. And I had realized that these examples aren't perfectly relevant to how we're going to be working with our data, but you can just see the structure of how we're going to actually set up our AJAX method. And what we're going to do in this case is call this jQuery.ajax. We know that this $sign is just shorthand for jQuery. So we're going to actually pass in the URL as they are here. We're going to specify our data type, and we're going to specify success. Once we get our data rendering, we can go back and also set up an error setting to handle if our data is not returned to us successfully. So let's go ahead and get started in our code. And returning to our file, we can go ahead and remove the comment here. And we're going to call our jQuery.ajax. And as we had seen in the examples, we're going to pass in an object. And this object is going to have all of the settings that we just talked about. So we're going to actually pass in our URL first. That's what we know we need. And our URL in this case is going to be a string that contains the URL to which the request is being sent. So if we go back here, we can actually just copy and paste this. You can find this in the show notes. That's going to be our URL. And separated by commas, we're going to pass in our next key value pair. I had said that we're going to use data type. So we can pass in our data type here. And we know that's going to be JSON. And lastly, let's work on our success. So success case in this case is going to be a function. And this function is actually going to, when we are in this success setting, if we reach this point where this code is being executed, we are being passed a response. And the response in this case is what's returned from the server. And we are requesting for the data to be returned. So this is where we hopefully get to interact with our data. So within this function here, we can access our response. Now, working with this a little bit more, we want to get some insight to this response. What's it actually going to be? Because we know once we're there, we want to actually append new HTML elements to our DOM and create those apartment listings. But let's get some insight as to what this response actually is. So we've used console.log in the past to kind of get some insight into our code to see what's being returned to us. But in this case, I want to introduce the debugger. The debugger is another great tool to give you some insight into how your code's performing. So what we're going to do is the debugger is available to us using JavaScript. We can just type in debugger here with a semicolon. And what this is going to do is actually pause our code executing when it reaches this debugger point. And so going back into our application now, if we are successfully being returned data, we should hit this debugger, and then we can examine what the response is. So when you put a debugger statement, the only way you can actually pause your code is if you have the DevTools open. So let's go ahead and open this. And the debugger is going to be hit essentially whenever that line of code is hit, which is when we refresh our application. We know that that AJAX method is being called right when we want our page to load. So what I'm saying is more or less, we're going to refresh the page now, and that debugger statement is going to be hit and pause our code for us. So refreshing the page, that's exactly what we would expect. So it's going to kind of pause the screen for us. We have an option to play or step through into the next part of the code. But let's go ahead and open it up here. So we did get into our success function, else this debugger wouldn't have been hit. And we can actually see what our response is. So it looks pretty good. It looks like the data that we examined in the JSON file. So we have an object, has an apartment's key, and a value that is an array of our 10 apartment objects. But if we want to examine that a little further, while we're paused here, we can actually access this response by working in the console down below. And now we can look a little bit further into this. We can see that we have our apartments, and then we can look into each individual object as well. So the great part about this is that we are actually receiving the data that we want. So now, what are we going to do with it?